So as you probably know, this is my fourth placement, and when I was in my second placement in Brampton, I wasn't yet pastor, I was still associate pastor. And I don't know if you know this, but when there's two priests assigned to a parish, and one's the pastor, one's the associate pastor, there's this kind of unwritten rule that the pastor does all the funerals and the associate pastor does all the weddings. I'm not sure why that is, you can speculate on your own, but it was the reverse for me actually when I was in this particular assignment. So even though I was still associate pastor, I did all the funerals and he did all the weddings. And I was still a young priest, and so just kind of imagine the situation where you're doing the funerals and all those things associated with funerals, right? So people in mourning and death is in the air, and so a certain kind of intimidation factor. And it was really scary and nearly going. But then after a while, as things progressed, I learned to appreciate funerals. Then I learned to like funerals, and now, even though it sounds weird, I love funerals. The reason why I love funerals is because it's a real opportunity to be real. The situation demands it, right? So death is in the air again, and we're talking about things of ultimate concern, and so it's a real opportunity to not just speak the truth, but to live out that same truth. And not everyone recognizes the moment, not everyone rises to the occasion. That's why some funerals aren't what they could be, but if people recognize that, the primacy of the truth in these situations, and again, they rise to the occasion, that's when the funerals are really beautiful and rich, and everyone becomes better as a result. And that's why, for example, if someone is at a funeral and they give the eulogy, they could be like an awful speaker, technically speaking, and say the ums and ahs and all these things you hear you're not supposed to do at Toastmasters, right? But as long as they're real and honest and true, it's like captivating, spellbinding in a certain sense. So something to remember next time you go to a funeral. Anyways, that's a long kind of preface to talk about today, right? Because, when you look at the Good Friday service, in a certain sense, depending on how you look at it, it's kind of like the funeral of Jesus Christ, right? So again, death is in the air, things of ultimate concern, and the corresponding opportunity to be real and speak the truth and live out the truth. And it's especially so because we're talking about Jesus Christ, who himself is the way and the truth and the life. So to kind of frame this thing that we're talking about today, I want to share with you an example that I actually raised a couple weeks ago, I think, at one of the weekday masses, but I thought in retrospect might be good for everyone to hear. So this is a video I watched on YouTube many years ago, and it was involving a Catholic priest who had a private revelation. And whether or not this private revelation was a real thing, or whether you believe it or not, doesn't matter, because the principle is true. So basically, in the context of this private revelation, this priest got a glimpse. He got a glimpse as to what his particular judgment would have been like if he died at that particular moment. So a glimpse as to what his particular judgment would have been like if he died at that particular moment. So, Catholicism 101, right? So everyone faces, technically, two judgments. There's what's called the particular judgment, and there's this other thing called the final judgment. The particular judgment takes place when you die. So when you die, the Lord shows you in a glimpse, in a flash, everything you've done, everything you failed to do, and you're judged. And you know right away where you're going, heaven, hell, or purgatory. Now in contrast, again, there's the final judgment. And the final judgment, technically speaking, isn't really a judgment, it's merely the public revelation of everyone's particular judgment. So in the words of my former spiritual director, the final judgment is merely embarrassing, right? Because everyone knows what everyone did, right? And so here's the situation. This guy gets a glimpse as to what his particular judgment would have been if he had died at the particular moment. Catholic priest, right? So the Lord went through all his different acts and omissions, the course of his life. Here are things you've done, here are things you failed to do in terms of like sin and immoral life and whatever. Now what's interesting is that in response to each one of these particular revelations, the priest was like, yes, yes, yes. No argument, no yes but, no excuses. It's just like, yes, those are the things I've done, and those are the things I failed to do. And even when the Lord said, therefore, you're condemned to an eternity in hell, the response was, yes. Again, no excuses, no backtalk. Not because he was afraid, but rather because he was in the presence of the truth. When you're in the presence of the truth, there's no room for falsehood. No room for excuses, no room for duplicity. There's simply the acceptance of that which is true, otherwise known as reality. Now, it's one of those things, you hear a story like that, it really kind of pins you against the wall, but it speaks to the level of authenticity we're all called to bring to bear when it comes to living our lives, when it comes to our relationship with Christ. And we're just not used to that. So many times we live in denial, where we're angry or blaming other people, all these different things that we do, argumentative, But here's the thing, you can argue with someone and you can even win the argument, but if you're wrong, you're wrong. That's the way the truth works. The truth remains the truth whether or not you acknowledge it or not. This comes true, obviously, in the context of the Passion narrative, especially in the context of the story, the subplot involving Pontius Pilate, right? So Pontius Pilate, as you know, bears the enormous, terrible, awful responsibility of what to do with Jesus Christ. Do I send him to his death, or do I set him free? You notice that he tries to pretend that it's not his responsibility. I put it off to the people of God. I put it off to King Herod. I put it off to the scribes and the Pharisees. I ask that question, what is truth? There's no such thing as truth. And I wash my hands. I wash my hands symbolically of this responsibility, except the responsibility was always his. And so the figure of Pontius Pilate is symbolic of our responsibility to take responsibility in our relationship with Christ, in our lives through the choices that we make. Now, in terms of how your story ends up, that question is left to be answered because luckily you're still alive, right? But when you look at Pontius Pilate, you know how his story ends. Based on the gospel you just heard, you know how his story ends. It ends in tragedy. And it comes true in this really important detail. It's like you blink and you miss it, right? So what happens is that after he sends Jesus Christ to his death to be crucified, he delivers this order. So the order is, okay, put this sign above the cross, the wood of the cross. And the sign is supposed to say, in Latin, Hebrew, and Greek, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Now remember, there's an objection. Some people say, well, no, don't say that. It sounds like a statement of fact. So say, this man said that he was the King of the Jews. In response to which, what happens? Pilate says, what I've written, I have written. What I have written, I have written. Loosely translated, I have always known that this guy was the King of the Jews. I was trying to blame other people. I was trying to wash my hands and say, what is truth? But I always knew. I always knew he was the King of the Jews. I knew who was the King of the universe. I knew he wasn't just speaking the truth. I always knew that he was the truth. And I did nothing. I didn't correspond to the truth. Why? Because I'm a coward? Because I'm afraid? Because I knew something in me would have to change and die? And I just backed away. So now what do? I proclaim my shame to the world in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. I could have been great. Could have been a saint. But now I'm forever known as that guy who sent Jesus Christ to his death. So yeah, that's my story, right? And that's how the story ends. It's one of those things, it's heavy stuff, right? And I was thinking about this a couple days ago, like different ways you can move forward from that. But one thing that came to mind, there's this book I read many years ago about prayer, and it's called Difficulties in Mental Prayer by Eugene Boylan. And the title doesn't matter, nor does the author matter, but you'll see where this is going, right? So he talks about difficulties in mental prayer, and one of the chapters has to do with distractions. Lots of different advice. One of the things he says is like, recognize the natural instability of the mind, right? So the mind has a tendency to wander. So be easy with yourself, be easy with your heart. So you know as you're drifting, just gently bring yourself back. But more to the point, one thing he says, which kind of ties back to what we're talking about today, he says sometimes the way to deal with distractions is to make the distractions the subject of your prayer. One way to deal with distractions is to make the distractions the subject of your prayer, which is basically to say this. Imagine you're praying, and there's this thing clamoring for your attention. You call that a distraction. The presumption is that that is from the evil spirit. It's not from the Lord. So, Lord, help me to not be distracted. Except maybe that's the prophetic voice of God. And you're just ignoring it. Like, it speaks to this notion of a relationship with Christ and our overall notion of Christianity. Hate to say it, but a lot of times we kind of reduce Christianity to this constant exhortation made to God the Father to provide a pillow for our weary heads. Take away my distractions. Take away my difficult circumstances. Take away this difficult person, right? That's our prayer that we kind of send to the Lord. But in the meantime, maybe here's the Lord, again, clamoring for our attention. Look at this thing that you don't want to look at, because this thing's going to change your life. And the question as to whether this thing is from the Lord or from the evil spirit, that's for you to decide with the help of people who are sent to help you with that sort of thing. But if you discern, and you discern properly that this distraction actually is the prophetic voice of Jesus Christ, pay attention. And it might be scary, as it was for Pontius Pilate, but if it is the voice of Christ, lead into new things. It might be scary, it might involve a certain dying to oneself, but always leads to new life, because the truth will always set you free.